Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members
Teresa, Linda, and Annie,
are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature, or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Hi, I'm Tim Kennelty,
And I'm Jean Taos.
and welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley.
Our guest today is Karen Waltuck, staff horticulturist for the Beatrix Farrand Garden Association. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. And to get
We're so excited to have you, really.
thank you for having me. I just want to say that we pronounce her name Beatrix Farrand.
We watched the DBT, and Jean didn't pay attention to that.
No, it's a very, very common mistake because people want to Frenchify her name and make it Farrand. So I understand it.
Especially with Cadwallader in the middle.
Right. It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to keep on the straight and narrow.
No, it's totally fine. During the making of our documentary, we met some distant relatives of hers who did verify that Beatrix pronounced it Farrand. So that's what we stick to.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Right from the horse's mouth. Right. Okay, well, I'm kind of baffled where to start. Now, your credentials are just all over the place, and it's really interesting. I got led astray by the fact that you're a violist.
Oh, are you a musician too? Was that interesting to you?
I consider myself one, but nobody else.
She's just impressed.
Yeah, I'm easily impressed. I suspect that since you're a professional, it's more than easily.
Yeah.
What was your garden background before you fell into this wonderful job?
Sure. Well, you're right. I'm a musician. I've been doing that for many decades. I was living in New York City in an apartment with no yard and no access to green spaces except for our public New York City parks, which I loved. So for years, I was a volunteer in the New York City parks and did a lot of weeding and a lot of whatever they needed us to do. And I just really fell in love with being outdoors and working with plants as a hobby. And I got into a lot of different volunteering programs and started being interested in the post-incarcerated population of New York City and decided I wanted to see what it was like inside the incarceration system. So I found a horticultural internship at Rikers Island through the Horticultural Society of New York. So I used to volunteer as an intern at the Rikers Island greenhouse program. And it was there that I really saw how plants are such a important part of our lives that so many people don't really participate anymore, and that it can do so much for us emotionally and physically. And it really made such a difference in the lives of the incarcerated population there. And I decided I wanted to learn more about working in public gardens because access to beautiful spaces is something that should be for everyone. So that was kind of how I got my foot in the door, seeing the importance of working with plants and how meaningful it should be for all of us. But the least that I could do was provide beautiful places for people in the public. So that's what got me started on my path.
I have to ask you a follow-up question.
Sure.
That it was the greenhouse. Did they have gardens at Rikers Island?
Yeah, it's called the greenhouse program because the classrooms and all of the propagation and stuff is in the greenhouse, but it's a 2-acre garden that has roses and raised beds with vegetables and fruit trees and maple trees and fig trees, and it's beautiful. It's been going on there since the 1990s, and it's an incredible program. I highly recommend you look into it. The Horticultural Society of New York, they do wonderful, wonderful things. So then I did an internship at Wave Hill Gardens in the Bronx, in Riverdale, Bronx. Really, really meaningful education, working with all of their seasoned senior gardeners there. And then worked in a New York City public park for several years before finding my way up to Hyde Park.
Good landing.
Yeah, no kidding. I got very lucky. I consider myself very lucky.
That's wonderful.
So we recently talked to your sometime collaborator, Hannah Cordova, and she filled us in on the fact that the Beatrix Farrand Association is now part of the National Park Service and the Roosevelt Estate. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because we all are really interested. We were interested in what she had to say, but would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Anna is our liaison. So she's the horticulturist for the National Park Service and all of the different campuses in our little area. So the Beatrix Farrand Garden Association is a nonprofit community group that has it in our mission to care for this one very specific historic garden that is on the grounds of the National Park Service. So back in the 1990s, the community got together and said, this is a site that is not being cared for in a restorative way. It was a pretty derelict location. And they decided that if the National Park Service didn't have the people power and perhaps didn't have the budget at the time to restore it, that it was valuable to the community to do this work for the national park. So they got together a proposal, a work of action proposal, and a formal contract was drawn up between the association and the National Park Service to become a national park partner group. And partner groups exist at many, many different national parks, more than you would ever realize. They act as philanthropic agencies to help raise money for special projects. They sometimes care for land like we do, but often they're behind the scenes raising money for specific meaningful renovations or restorations or different projects that happen at national parks all over the country. So we actually have many different sister park partner groups. There's a group that takes care of the Vanderbilt Association gardens. That's their annual display. There's a park partner group that takes care of that. There's a group that helps raise money at Valkill. So there's lots of different groups around, and we're the ones that take care of the Beatrix Farrand Garden at the FDR National Historic Site.
So Bellefield was around and falling into disrepair when they took it over. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, the garden itself was. That is correct. So the land that we are part of is attached to an estate called Bellefield. It's a mansion on the estate. It's actually the original building that was on the grounds of our FDR Historic Site. So it predates Springwood and it predates the library and everything else that you see on the campus. The original home was Bellefield. And that house is now the national headquarters of the National Park Service Administration. So all the different officers and rangers and people have their offices in that building. It's not a public building. But the garden that's attached to it was designed by Beatrix Farrand. And so that was the site that the community group decided they wanted to be responsible for stewarding.
And if we visited, I would be able to see both gardens at the same time.
Definitely. There's sign when you first drive into the driveway of the FDR National Historic Site. You'll see a sign that says Bellefield, and very small underneath it says Beatrix Farrand Garden, and it's open to the public. The grounds of the whole campus are free to explore. So there's trails through the woods. We have our garden. There's the vegetable home garden. There's the rose garden at the grave sites of FDR and Eleanor. There's a lot of different places that are completely free, open every single day from dawn to dusk, and you're always welcome to just come and explore with your dogs and your children and have a picnic. So our garden is part of that free admittance area that you're welcome to come anytime.
Is the Bellefield Garden, the Beatrix Farrand Garden,
Yes.
Still the main focus of the association, or is that mission expanded?
I think in the beginning years, it was really focused on renovating the interior. The interior had no existent plants in the beds. It was covered in black plastic. It had been put to bed in the 1970s when the land was donated to the National Park Service. They put the gardens to bed because they didn't have a system yet in place to take care of it. So for a couple of decades, it was pretty fallow. There was not a lot going on in there. So I think in the beginning of the association in 1994, it was incorporated. So this is our 30th anniversary year of stewarding. They decided that the main focus was raising money to purchase a lot of plants and to get a whole system and design in place for the interior. But in the last few years, we've expanded our mission a little bit to also include wanting to provide public events and programs for the community so that they could see that this was a garden that was also for their use. So rather than have it be this secret garden, this private secret garden, we wanted to put a lot of energy into getting the word out to make sure that all of our neighbors in the community and all of you, and, having this program is a perfect way for us to get the word out even more, that people should come and visit it and use it because it's now public and free and accessible. So we have a lot of cultural programs and lectures and talks and all sorts of things that happen in the garden all year long. So
when that renovation started, did you have original plans from Beatrix Farrand, or how did you go about even beginning that, or how did they go?
So that predates me, but the story is that there was a college student who was a local Hudson Valley resident, and was doing a project in landscape architecture and was interested in the work of Beatrix Farrand. And so looking through her records, kind of understood that there was this Beatrix Farrand garden somewhere in Hyde Park, and found this walled, fallow, derelict space at Bellefield. And as her project in college wrote up this original proposal saying, if we find enough information and we understand how to go about doing a meaningful renovation, could we have this permission of the federal government, of the National Park Service, to do this renovation? So in her research, she looked through the old archives of design work that Beatrix had left to UC Berkeley in California, and found the original drawings for the garden and the original layout of...
It's so cool.
Yeah, it did. But the one thing it was missing was it didn't have a plant list. So we knew all of the different things that she intended for the trellising of the walls, the vertical plants on the walls, and for how the gates should be rebuilt, because the gates at that point were totally rotten to nothing. They didn't have any working gates, so they all had to be rebuilt. But we had Farrand's original drawings of the carpentry for those gates, and a handful of other things that gave us some insight into how she intended this garden to be. So after researching other plans and other sites that Farrand had done during this era, we compiled a plant list and put it in as close as we could muster to what we think she would have intended for a site like ours. So it does include a lot of plants that are kind of in her palette of plants. But we have to say, in all honesty, it's not 100% positive that this would be what she would have done originally, but we tried our best.
That's amazing. I have a question.
Sure.
Whatever became of this student that came up with this whole project? I want to know 30 years in real life. It's like a movie.
Oh, yeah. So she's now, I can't remember her original title, but she works at Innisfree Gardens, which is not too far away from us. Yeah.
So this helps us relate to, we read about the wild garden at Bellefield, basically what you're talking about.
Well, that's the latest part of our renovation. So we had this design plan that included a large bird's eye view of the garden that shows where all the beds are laid out, and that, all of the geometry of her design for how the interior walls are laid out, and the hedges and everything else, and the paths and everything else. And then on the outside of that main walled garden drawing, Farrand has this squiggly little line that goes all the way around the entire length of the garden, east to west. And it said in her drawing, wild garden. And that's all that we had to go off of. So looking at other designs that Farrand did during her career, she made almost 200 different garden sites. So we looked at a lot of other drawings and saw that was kind of a recurrent theme, that she had other kind of formal ornamental gardens close to the building, and then on the exterior of it, a more organic, looser design that would be labeled wild garden. And we took that to interpret that it should be more native plants, looser, big kind of swaths of plants, not quite as ornamental and designed as the interior home garden, but then something that kind of takes you out into more unmanicured landscape. And we wanted to put this in, even though it had never been done to her specifications. So she designed this garden for a family living there in the early 1900s, and probably gave them several options of things that they could have chosen from her design proposal. And this was not something that did get put in. But in order to tell Farrand's whole story, we want to talk about her use of native plants. She was an early proponent of native plants long before it was trendy. She used them a lot because they work well in our area. If you plant Northeast plants in the Northeast, they will be very successful, and she used them in a lot of her designs.
So she got pushback when she originally was doing that. We were just watching the DVD, and basically it talked about, not everybody thought of that as a real garden, right? Because they were so formalistic in many times that she was working on these.
Yeah, she brought over from Europe a lot of influence from like the English cottage garden that was a lot looser, I think, than American gardens were at the time, where everything was very formal and had a lot of specimen plants. She really used a lot of texture overlap and lots of different successions of blooms and things that were happening with perennials that were not of the era. Annuals were still such a vibe with people wanting to have really specific sections of things in specific sections of places. And she had a lot of perennials that would just kind of fill in an area in a more naturalistic way. So I'm sure the use of native plants at the time, it might have been even a little challenging to source those plants because they probably weren't nursery available in the way that they are now.
Do you get any feel for whether it was more about concept and design that she was interested in native plants, or she also kind of understood the interaction of native plants in the environment? Was she interested in attracting birds and supporting pollinators and things like that, or was it more about design?
I'll have a feeling that it was a little bit of both. She studied under Charles Sprague Sargent at the Arnold Arboretum, and he was really knowledgeable about native plants and, how to use things in an area where they're going to thrive. And having learned that from him, I'm sure she saw the benefit of not forcing a plant into a place where it's not going to do well, that you want to think of it mindfully and holistically. And so I think she probably learned that lesson from him. She also collaborated a lot with someone who is very interesting to us lately because we just acquired one of his pieces, but he was a sculptor. He was a photographer and architect, but he was also very well known as a sculptor, Eric Soderholtz. He made a lot of the benches and urns and bird baths that she used in many of her designs, including at Dumbarton Oaks. And we just recently acquired one of his bird baths. And he wrote a lot about the importance of having bird baths in a garden because of the work they did to attract birds and insects. And the fact that she used his bird baths so frequently in her gardens, I want to think that was also on her mind because he wrote little magazines about the importance of birds and gardens, and having a garden that cultivates and supports lots of different kinds of life is a very attractive thing. So she didn't write about it so much that I'm aware of. I might be wrong. I haven't read every single thing that she wrote and every single book about her, but she didn't write about it as much as like an entomology kind of background, but I think she did think about holistically the health of a place.
Amazing. I mean, so forward looking.
Definitely, really ahead of her time in that era, definitely.
Okay, so here's the base question. We've all heard of her. We know about the wild gardens now, which we didn't before. Why was she the one that was so important?
I think there were probably a lot of women doing a lot of very interesting things that we have lost those stories because the history just didn't continue the telling of these people that were very important for reasons we understand. And I think she's a person who did so many significant sites that still exist. So many of her things are lost, unfortunately, but there's still a lot of sites that she created that do exist and that we can see just kind of the deep talent that she had. And this is an example of a person that she was not getting the airtime that she deserved for having such a talent. So I think it's just another case of a marginalized person whose story we almost lost, and we're all now really understanding how important it is to tell these stories and to hold on to them. So,
and she managed to keep a vast body of work, even with as much as there was lost.
Right. And she definitely had her privileges, right? She came from money. Her family was very well to do and had a lot of connections. So she got her foot in the door, beginning her career with a lot of important, influential connections. But it became so apparent that she also just was brilliant. She had an extremely extremely creative mind for how to set a garden into a space. I mean, even our garden, if you come to visit, one of the things that people talk about that's very interesting about our space is that she uses this forced perspective in the garden to make it feel much longer and bigger than it actually is. There's the walls and the hedges have an architectural telescoping optical illusion that as you're looking from the house away through the garden, it looks like it just goes on and on and on and on. This is something that she made this design for a family's backyard garden, but it's so elegant and it's so fascinating and different. She did this type of work at a lot of places where she thought so creatively about a space, and she knew her plants and she knew propagation. She put a lot of interesting things into spaces. So she wasn't just someone who should be forgotten to history. It's so wonderful now that we have these spaces and we can talk about her story.
Oh, and Dumbarton Oaks, you had mentioned, and Jean's been there. Unfortunately, I've never been there. Love to go there. It was important historically, right? And so many gardens are that seem to have influence over big decisions, big world decisions. The UN Charter about Dumbarton Oaks, correct?
You can't quote me because I don't know, but I think that's true. I think one of the very first talks regarding, yes, the drawing up of the charter, I think one of the first talks did happen there. But
I found a quote. It said about the Dumbarton Oaks meeting, they called it, I guess. It said it was hoped that by holding the informal conference in Dumbarton Oaks, this was China, Russia, England, and us,
right,
delegates would be more apt to engage in discussions of global harmony and security.
So, I mean, we see over and over these really important decisions being made when people have been in gardens and influenced and, feel in the appropriate moods about it. It's just really influential over kind of what happens in the world.
I think going back to what I first said about my background and how I got into working with plants, I also think gardens are a great equalizer because plants don't care about how much money you make or where you're from or anything. Like you can go into a place and we all are just tapping back into our early human brains of being excited by being surrounded by life and seeing a lot of textural difference and a lot of sounds and smells and sensory input. Like, I think it's just a great equalizer.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I know that there are a lot of studies have been done in terms of, mood and people's productivity and everything else when they're out in the environment, but also especially out in beautiful.
Yeah, I think everyone should have access and know where they feel welcome. We hope our garden makes everyone feel welcome, regardless of your background. I think it's great. Like more schools are putting in growing their own vegetables, and different places are seeing the benefit of having green spaces in cities. So I hope that people come and use our garden for good mental health reinforcement.
And she really believed in open access to the public too, which was kind of a new concept as well, right?
Yeah, she worked in a lot of public spaces. So she worked for many different colleges. She did a lot of public spaces like at different universities. And I think she understood that in the same way that gardens should be for everyone and everyone should have access to beautiful things. So she worked at Acadia National Park as a consultant. She did a lot of different places that were for the public. And I have to hope that she'd be happy that the Bellefield Garden is now a public place too.
I'm sure she would.
Yeah.
And I mean, coming from such a privileged background, it's not a huge leap it is a huge leap to think that she was thinking about the public and not about these kind of cloistered spaces, which is pretty impressive.
I think it just has such a good eye and such an interesting perspective that I don't know much about jobs she turned down, but I have to hope that she was just happy to be working and happy to be successful.
Well, and as a musician, you're a communicator, and I hear you have a Farrand Friends Friday YouTube series. Oh my goodness!
Oh, that hasn't happened in quite a while, but I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, those are all from COVID times. So when
well, they're good.
Yeah, thank you. So being on the grounds of the National Park Service, we stayed open for as long as we could, but our garden is gated, and to get in and out of the gates, you have to, manually open a gate. It's never locked. You just have to open the gate to let yourself in. And so we were worried for a while because none of us understood how COVID was spreading in those early days. So we did have to close the garden for several months to the public. And I was just so concerned with people feeling separate from one another and from feeling, disengaged from their season of growing and the flowers that were coming up. That was in March, and April, May is such a beautiful time. And I just felt so bad that I was the only one getting to see the garden. So I started that series of videos just as a way to feel connected to people during COVID. So I haven't made one since. Those are all from 2020, but I'm glad you found them.
We'll get back to that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully now people can come in person. So thank God.
Well, true, but in the winter, that'd be kind of nice to sit there and watch.
Sure. Yeah.
And Cordova was in a couple of.
Yeah, she and her colleague, Susan McCavery, were at a couple of them doing their wonderful work at the parks.
We envy you in your job. It must be wonderful to go to work every day. And I guess our question that we always ask people kind of at the end in closing is, the world is a kind of difficult, challenging place now. What gives you hope on a daily basis in terms of, being in the garden or doing your work, or working with other people? What gives you hope?
I guess I would probably just disagree with you that the world is a hard place, because I think it's always been a hard place, and I just think that that's part of life. I think there's good and there's bad, and that there's just constant cycles coming and going. And I think gardens really help me stay connected to that, because it's so cyclical, and you get to see the birth and life and then death and decay on a seasonal year repeating basis. Every year there's good and bad. Every year there might be a new pest, there might be new weather, there might be a new fungus, there might be new something that's a little challenging, and then next year it might be better. So I just see gardens as a really tangible symbol of how just life is a series of good and bad, success and failure. Nothing is a straight line, nothing is a constant, and I think that's true for the era we live in, and true for our own bodies and the lives we are living. And gardens
Really just the answer. I think we want to hang out with you.
Down later for a lot of these. And that is great. Well, that's a great big picture.
It is a great big picture, because a lot of people tell us, the youth are what inspire me, but yours is a really interesting, kind of complex answer. We appreciate it.
Well, I just think gardens are a really good teacher, and if you just spend time with them seasonally, you see that it's just an analogy for everything. Gardens are just the life that's coming and going in the garden is the same as your own. And so if you can notice it and slow down and be present, that's all any of us could really hope for in life, right? Is just to notice the beauty of it.
Here.
Yeah, absolutely. That was wonderful. Karen, thank you so much.
I hope that you'll visit. That's really the goal of this, is that I want you to visit, and I want your listeners to visit and feel welcomed and come learn something new and enjoy it.
Well, we're coming with a rule.
No, you are.
Yeah.
Good.
Definitely.
Speaking of which, the garden is beautiful at pretty much all times of the year, correct?
I think so. Definitely in the dead of winter, if it hasn't snowed, when it's covered in snow, it's amazing, because you get to see the bones of the garden. You see the walls and the shape of it all, and the design of it against the house is beautiful. When it's not covered in snow and it's in the muddy winter of January, maybe not so beautiful, but still interesting. Yeah. Oh, September, October, we have a lot of asters and anemone, and all the foliage is starting to change all around the park. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Powers and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at Columbia Green mgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acre. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities